A few people have seen my disclaimer in the past and asked whether I could do a video on archaeological topics that I'm interested in. So I thought on this occasion I would, and I probably will end up doing a few videos on this topic, and that is livestock in early medieval England. And the reason I'm interested in this is kind of an extension of the reason a lot of archaeologists are interested in what their, whatever the focus of their study is, and that is because it's a very mundane thing in terms of the people who actually lived at the time being studied. So at the time, livestock would have been central to a lot of people's daily activities, and that's partly why I find them so interesting, because a lot of people's lives would have revolved around these animals. And although a lot of archaeological studies will kind of justify their existence by using livestock to make some broader point about people in general, I think that livestock are very interesting in their own right, although it is hard to come up with a study of livestock that doesn't end up also kind of being a study of people as well. My bachelor's dissertation was on metrical analysis of sheep in London between the Roman and the early medieval periods, and my master's dissertation was on stable isotope analysis of pig bones in prehistoric Britain, and I'm hoping to wrangle in a couple of my old lecturers to talk about those techniques in a later video related to this one. So I won't go too far into those techniques at the moment, but I will go through a bit of the textual evidence. A really good all-in-one resource for this kind of thing is Debbie Banham and Rosamund Faith's book, Anglo-Saxon Farms and Farming, and that covers livestock and arable, but as well as referring to that, I'll also try to refer to a few journal articles and things. The first kind of livestock animal I was interested in was the sheep, and that was kind of because I was interested in upland farming of the kind that you see in Cumbria and Dartmoor and places like that, and I wanted to see how far back we could trace the techniques used to do that today. But the upland aspect of that was impossible to do for lack of data. But one of the first things that my lecturer Jim Morris taught me about livestock in archaeology is that sheep and goats are very often indistinguishable in an archaeological context. So in a kind of spreadsheet of animal metrical data or stable isotope data, a lot of the time you will just see data points that are just marked sheep/goat because the researcher couldn't tell which one it was. And that's normally because the kinds of bones that survive in waste deposits don't vary very much between sheep and goats. And that's one of a few places where it's useful to turn to medieval literature to get some idea of what the proportions were. So how many sheep did people own relative to goats? And the overwhelming idea that one gets from that, as Banham and Faith point out, is that people owned a lot more sheep than they owned goats. And that lines up with the instances where you actually can positively ID sheep and goats in the archaeological records. So if you have things like skulls, which are easier to positively ID as sheep or goat, you tend to have a lot more sheep skulls than you have goat skulls. Having worked a bit with living sheep and goats at Butser Ancient Farm, which is well worth a visit if you're in the Hampshire area in the UK, goats are a lot more difficult to keep contained, which is a problem if you have crops and things nearby. So sheep, even if they can escape, in plenty of cases they'll choose not to unless they're kind of pressed. So if you're herding them into a corner, they might go over a fence that they wouldn't normally go over. Whereas goats will escape if you give them the slightest opportunity. So it might be that having a small number of goats where you can see them was seen as the most practical way of keeping them. And Banham and Faith go into a bit more evidence as to why goats might have been kept in some places and not others. So place name evidence suggests that they tended to be kept in places where grazing was a bit rougher and things like that. A lot of breeds of sheep actually have what's called a hefting instinct, which causes them to stay more or less where they were brought up anyway. So even if they weren't contained, as a lot of them aren't in upland farming contexts, they'll still stay fairly local. Animals in archaeological deposits are often measured by their height at the withers, which is the ridge between the shoulder blades. So in other words, the height of the shoulder basically, rather than the head. And there are strong correlations between the withers height and the length of certain long bones, like the humerus and femur, and those correlations seem to apply across breeds. So even if you don't have the full skeleton of an animal, you can often work out how tall it would have been, roughly. Over the course of the early medieval period, you had fluctuations in the sizes of all these species, just like you do nowadays. But to give you an idea of their vague height in relation to a person, according to Banham and Faith, the average cow was about this tall, the average sheep was about this tall, and the average pig was about this tall, bearing in mind I'm somewhere between 5'10 and 5'11. I'll get into talking about the more fun aspects of the appearance of these livestock and the etymology of names for them in a little while, but and I'll put a time on screen if you want to skip to that. But for the time being, I'll talk a little bit about one of the big things I was interested in when I did my bachelor's dissertation, and that was, can we work out whether early medieval people in England maintained distinct breeds of livestock? Any population of animals spread over an entire country will show variation, but did people take advantage of this variation and deliberately keep separate breeds of sheep, cattle, pig, and whatever else? M.L. Ryder did some work towards answering this question between the 60s and the 80s on sheep, and he tried to trace modern sheep breeds backwards in time in an attempt to see how far back he could get. And he classed them into 6 categories that were supposed to be kind of clades of breeds. So breeds within a clade are supposed to be more closely related to each other than they are to breeds outside of the clade. And he suggested that modern regional breeds had started to develop by the end of the 1500s, and by the 1700s those were starting to be described in modern terms. But it's still not completely clear whether that kind of regional variation existed in the early medieval period. One way that I tried to do this with sheep was by using metrical data from London, in other words data that comes from measuring bones, to see if there were any sudden changes in the proportions of sheep bones that might suggest a new breed of sheep being introduced to the London area. What I found was actually quite strange in that case. So across several sites I found that early medieval sheep had much smaller teeth than Roman sheep had beforehand, and that all of a sudden sheep with normal sized teeth started to pop up towards the turn of the millennium. And although this was just a bachelor's dissertation, I don't want to give it more weight than it deserves, that trend seemed to be a real thing rather than just a recording error, and it seemed to indicate that these were 2 separate populations of sheep and not just one population that had been selectively bred. So what were these livestock actually like? We'll start with pigs. A lot of people have drawn a comparison between early medieval pigs and Iron Age pigs and the modern Tamworth breed. So not only have Banham and Faith made that comparison, but Butser Ancient Farm, where I volunteer, has recently acquired some piglets that are a cross between Tamworths and Wild Boar, which are supposed to represent Iron Age pigs, which is earlier than our period. As far as modern breeds resembling ancient breeds go, I think this is probably a very good analogue for an early medieval pig as well. Depictions of pigs from the time show that they're less fat and more bristly than modern varieties, and that they have ears that stick up like a wild boar, and also that they were gingery in colour at least some of the time. If you went back in time, you might find them in a couple of environments. You might find them in enclosures around a farm, probably close to where the people lived, so they could be fed on food waste and things like that. Or you might find them in a forest kind of setting, eating things from the forest floor, probably being watched by a swineherd to make sure they didn't wander off. Foddering pigs on forest litter is cross-culturally common because the food is just there. You don't need to produce it for them. Pigs will eat things that other animals won't eat. The only downside is that if they wander off, they can live happily in the wild and establish feral populations, which then become an agricultural pest. One word for a pig was swine, which gives us the modern word swine, and if you've learnt German you'll probably know the cognate Schwein, which also means pig. And these 2 words, swine and Schwein, come from a common ancestor that sounded something like swino, which comes from the same Proto-Indo-European root as Old English sul, which gives us the word sow. And both of these are cognate with the Latin word sus, which means pig. One Latin word for pig-like is suinus, which actually ends up sounding quite a lot like swine. If you've not come across the idea of cognates before, remember these Old English words don't come from Latin words, but they share a common ancestor with them in the same way that 2 cousins share a grandmother. Another fun pig-related word is faurch, and this seems to have meant piglet, but it gives us the modern English word farrow, which is a litter of piglets. But this word faurch also goes back to a Proto-Indo-European root, which ultimately gives us another Latin word, and that word is porcus, a young pig. And of course this word was loaned into English as pork, so pork and farrow ultimately come from the same root. Sheep were probably kept in bigger flocks, and it's a lot harder to find a primitive breed today that's likely to perfectly resemble an early medieval breed. So there are primitive breeds like the Soe and the Manx Lochtan, but these have features that aren't typical of early medieval sheep. So for example, some Manx Lochtans have 4 horns, which makes them look very imposing, but early medieval sheep seem to have mostly had only 2 horns, although that doesn't rule out there being a few with 4. And both male and female sheep probably had horns across most of the country, although there is some evidence for female sheep who have been polled, in other words, had their horns taken off by hand or through selective breeding. Illustrations suggest that whitish wool existed among early medieval sheep. Whether it was perfectly white or just kind of off-white isn't completely clear, but it probably varied from sheep to sheep even within a flock, and we definitely shouldn't imagine that just because modern primitive breeds are brown, that early medieval sheep must have been brown as well, because after all, they'd been subjected to thousands of years of selective breeding, and the colour of a sheep's coat is directly relevant to its product in a way that it isn't as much with something like a pig. The Old English word sharp becomes the modern word sheep. The word ewe gives us the modern word ewe, and this word might be of interest to zoologists because it's cognate with the Latin word ovis, which makes up the generic part of the sheep's binomial name, that part describing its genus. Both of those words come from a common ancestor in Proto-Indo-European. At around the same time Classical Latin was spoken and its speakers were saying ovis, speakers of Proto-Germanic would have said something like ovis, which isn't that far off, so maybe travellers would have recognised the similarity. The way they're allocated in wills and things suggests that cows were the most important livestock in people's minds, and also in terms of their economic significance. So famously, the word filch could mean cattle or property. In a lot of ways, it seems like cattle weren't just a way of making money, but in many cases were thought of as money themselves. And what they looked like is less clear, apart from their size, which I've already gone over. I normally avoid the term status symbol as much as I can, because I think it can reduce a complex cultural phenomenon to just this person more important than this person, but I think it's appropriate to call cattle a status symbol here. If you had lots of good quality ones, you were rich. That was what being rich was. And because of that importance and the distribution of modern breeds across the world, I think cattle must have come in a load of colours. So Banham and Faith point to one of the remedies in the medical textbook Lagnunga, which says that you need the milk of a cow that's only one colour. And if they're making a point of saying you need milk from a cow of one uniform colour, that suggests that there were cows with one uniform colour and also cows with some kind of multicoloured pattern. If you're doing a reconstruction and you have to put an early medieval cow into it, anything from a uniform black coat to a uniform reddish-brown coat to a kind of patterned coat is probably alright. Bear in mind that the piebald black and white coats we see nowadays in the UK belong to a specific clade of breeds, Holstein Friesians, and that's not in any way default for a cow, although that kind of colour scheme does exist in a lot of ungulates, and it's completely possible that some early medieval cows had that kind of colour scheme just by coincidence, although it almost certainly wasn't the norm. The Old English word coo gives us the modern word cow, but the word cattle is a more recent loan from French. In Old English, the nominative plural of coo was cu or chu, probably depending on where in the country you were. And if that had survived to modern English, it would be kai or chai, and in fact there are some dialects, including Cumbrian, where kai was the normal plural of cow until fairly recently. As I said, I hope to get a couple of my lectures in at some point to explain a couple of the methods we can use to study livestock in archaeology, and hopefully I can go into a bit more detail about the textual evidence and the social status of livestock as well. But until then, thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.